Khmer Amulets, dark rituals that bring death. In this chilling tale, Tom, a war veteran, encounters a series of terrifying events while guarding a desolate village near the Cambodian border. After a fellow soldier dies under mysterious circumstances, Tom is thrust into a world of dark rituals, vengeful spirits, and chilling confrontations with both human and supernatural forces. As a young woman from the village goes missing and gruesome deaths begin to occur, Tom realizes that something far more sinister is lurking in the shadows. With his life at stake, he must confront a possessed soldier named Kyo, who is driven by bloodlust and dark magic. In a dramatic and terrifying showdown, Tom must outwit both the living and the dead to survive, unraveling a horrifying secret that reveals the true power of ancient Cambodian curses. Part 1. A mysterious warning. Tom shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes tracing the raindrops trickling down the cafe window. The air outside had grown thick with humidity, the kind that suffocated you in the middle of the jungle, even though the rain had just begun. It was late afternoon, but the storm had turned the sky an ominous shade of grey, casting long shadows inside the cafe, the scent of damp earth mixed with the bitter aroma of coffee. Tom had come to this tiny, roadside cafe to escape the silence of his empty quarters stationed near the Cambodian border, miles away from anything that resembled home. He absent-mindedly sipped his coffee, its warmth doing little to ease the cold sense of dread creeping up his spine. Something about today felt off. He had spent weeks in this remote village, and while the locals had always been distant, they seemed more on edge recently. Whispers, muffled conversations, and worried glances had become commonplace. The village, once just a quiet backdrop to his long, uneventful nights, now felt alive with unspoken secrets. The door creaked open, drawing Tom's attention. A gust of wind and rain followed an old man inside. His tattered raincoat clung to his thin frame, and he moved with a slow, deliberate gait, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Tom had seen him around before, a regular like himself, but they had never spoken. The man, wrinkled and hunched with age, carried a certain sadness in his eyes, the kind that only comes from years of witnessing things no one should ever see. Tom watched as the old man sat down at the table across from him, sighing deeply as he did. Their eyes met for a moment, and Tom gave a polite nod. The man returned the gesture with a grim smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Something about the man intrigued Tom. He wasn't like the other villagers. He wasn't afraid to be in the cafe during a storm, nor did he seem to share their quiet fear. Storms like these. The old man began, his voice gravelly from age and perhaps from things left unsaid. They have a way of bringing back things that should stay buried. Tom raised an eyebrow but remained silent. The old man had never spoken to him before, but his tone now was that of someone who had carried a burden for far too long and was ready to release it whether Tom wanted to hear it or not. The old man leaned back in his chair, wiping the rain from his brow with a weathered hand. His eyes, grey like the storm outside, fixed on something distant, as if he could see far beyond the walls of the cafe, beyond the storm itself. "I've been here longer than most," the man said, his voice lowering, as though revealing a secret. "Long enough to know what hides in the shadows of this place. Long enough to know what's real, what's not." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure of where this was going, but something in the old man's voice kept him from leaving. There was a heaviness to his words, a weight that made the air in the cafe feel colder. "Ever heard of the spirits that haunt this land?" the man asked, locking eyes with Tom. "They say the river by the border isn't just water, it's a graveyard. For those who fought, for those who suffered, for those who never found peace." Tom had heard plenty of stories about the war, about the bloodshed and the lives lost. He had seen his share of horror on the battlefield, but he had never been one to believe in ghosts. "I don't believe in fairy tales," Tom muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence he usually had when dismissing such things. The old man chuckled, a sound that was more of a rasp. "Fairy tales? No, these aren't fairy tales, boy. What I've seen. Well, fairy tales would be a mercy. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something unsettling. I was a soldier once, like you, he began. It was a long time ago, during the height of the conflict. I was stationed not far from here on night patrol along the river. Back then, we didn't know much about the land we were fighting on. We didn't know it was cursed. Tom's grip tightened around his coffee cup, a chill running down his spine despite the warm liquid inside. One night, the man continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, I saw her, a woman, standing at the river's edge, just staring across the water. At first I thought she was one of the locals, maybe lost, or maybe just trying to cross the border. But something was off. It was late, far past curfew, and no one dared come out at night, not with the tension so high. Still there she was. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he recounted the story, and Tom noticed the lines of scars crisscrossing his knuckles, remnants of battles fought long ago. I called out to her, he said, but she didn't move. Didn't even flinch. Just kept standing there, her back to me, her long hair hanging down her shoulders. I thought maybe she didn't hear me, so I took a step closer. But then he paused, his breath catching in his throat. She turned, the man's voice faltered, his eyes darting to the window, as if he expected the woman to appear at any moment. Tom's pulse quickened. Despite himself, he was hanging on every word. When she turned, the old man whispered, his voice barely audible, her face. It wasn't human. It was pale, almost white, like all the life had been drained from her. But it wasn't just the color, it was her eyes. Hollow, empty, like they'd seen too much. And her mouth, God, her mouth was twisted into this grin. This horrible grin, like she was laughing at me, mocking me. But there was no sound. Tom felt his heart racing now, the cold dread from earlier settling deeper in his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, but the old man continued, his voice now shaking with the memory. I ran, he admitted, shame flickering in his eyes. I ran as fast as I could back to camp. I told my co, but he didn't believe me. Thought I was losing my mind, said the jungle does that to men. But I know what I saw. I know she was real. The cafe seemed to go darker, the storm outside intensifying, lightning flashing through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. After that night, the old man went on. Men started disappearing. Soldiers on patrol just gone, like they'd vanished into thin air. The locals wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't even acknowledge it. But I knew it was her, that thing, that ghost, or whatever the hell she was. She was taking them. And no one believed me. Tom's chest tightened. He didn't want to believe the story, didn't want to give in to the fear gnawing at him. But something about the old man's words rang true. I tried to fight her, the man whispered, his voice breaking. One night I went back to the river. I thought, if I could face her, maybe I could stop her. Maybe I could put an end to it. But when I got there, she was waiting. She was always waiting. Tom leaned forward, barely breathing, as the old man's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. She didn't speak. She never spoke. But I could feel her thoughts, feel her anger, her hatred. And then, before I could even move, she was on me. Cold hands, like ice, around my throat. I struggled, tried to break free, but it was no use. She wasn't human. She was stronger than any man I'd ever faced. The old man's hands instinctively reached for his neck, as if reliving the moment. Tom felt a shiver crawl down his spine, his body tense, heart pounding in his chest. But then, the man said, his voice cracking, something happened. I don't know what. Maybe it was a fear, maybe it was pure luck, but I managed to break free. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was far from that cursed river. Tom swallowed hard, the unease settling in his gut. The old man looked at him, his eyes dark, filled with a warning that seemed to pierce Tom's soul. You may not believe me now, soldier, the man said, his voice low and serious, but you will. Because one day she'll come for you, just like she came for me. And when she does, you'll wish you'd never set foot in this godforsaken place with that. The old man stood, pulling his raincoat tighter around him. He left the cafe without another word, disappearing into the storm, leaving Tom alone with the weight of his words and the growing sense of dread that someone was watching him. Part 2. The Disappearance. The night was suffocatingly still, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Tom lay in his bunk, staring up at the ceiling, his mind heavy with the old man's story. The cafe encounter had left a strange, unsettled feeling inside him, a mixture of disbelief and dread. Ghosts weren't real, he told himself for the 100th time. They were just stories born from fear and isolation, and yet he couldn't shake the way the old man's eyes had burned with something too real, too raw to be a mere fabrication. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the faint dripping of water from the leaves and the distant croak of frogs. Tom turned on his side, trying to push the thoughts from his mind, willing himself to sleep. But the silence was too loud, his heart too restless. Then it came, a voice, faint and trembling, carried on the humid night air. "Help. Please. Help me." Tom froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained to listen, but for a moment there was nothing but the eerie stillness outside. He tried to convince himself he had imagined it, just the remnants of the old man's haunting tale playing tricks on his mind. But then it came again, more insistent this time. The voice of a woman, barely audible but filled with desperation. "Please, someone help me." His pulse quickened. Tom sat up in bed, listening intently. The voice was distant, coming from somewhere outside, somewhere near the river. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay put. He knew better than to wander around the jungle at night, especially alone. But the sound of that voice, there was something about it, something that dug into him, compelling him to move. Whoever she was in trouble, and no one else seemed to hear her, no one else was coming to help. Tom grabbed his flashlight and rifle, his heart thudding heavily in his chest as he quietly stepped out into the night. The village was eerily silent, the air thick with moisture and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The only sound was the soft squelch of his boots in the mud as he moved through the narrow paths between the huts, heading toward the river. The voice came again, weaker this time. "Help me, please." Tom quickened his pace, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he couldn't stop. His feet moved almost on their own, pulling him closer to the riverbank, where the voice seemed to be coming from. The trees parted as he reached the river, revealing a wide stretch of water, black as ink under the cloudy sky. The moon, hidden behind the thick clouds, cast no light to guide him, but Tom didn't need it. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick reeds along the shore and the slow, winding current of the river. Then he saw her. A figure stood on the opposite bank, shrouded in the mist that rose from the water. A woman, her back turned to him, her long, dark hair cascading down her back in tangled waves. She was barefoot, her white dress clinging to her slender frame, stained with mud and damp from the river's edge. Tom's breath caught in his throat. His hand tightened around the flashlight, his heart racing. "Hey," he called out, his voice louder than he intended. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't move, she just stood there, motionless, her back still turned to him, as if she hadn't heard him, as if she were waiting for something. A chill ran down Tom's spine. He felt the cold, creeping tendrils of fear curling around him, but he pushed them down. She needed help. Whoever she was, she didn't belong out here alone in the middle of the night. Not this close to the border, not with everything the old man had said. Miss Tom shouted again, taking a step closer to the water's edge. "What are you doing out here still?" She didn't move. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the muddy shore and the low hum of the jungle behind him. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. But before he could call out again, she turned. The movement was slow, almost mechanical, as if her body were a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. When she finally faced him, Tom's blood ran cold. Her face was pale, ghostly white in the beam of his flashlight. But it wasn't just the color that unsettled him. her eyes empty, hollow, like black voids that seemed to stare straight through him. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque, wide smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the same smile the old man had described, the same horrible grin that made Tom's skin crawl. The woman stared at him, her head tilted slightly, her body unnaturally still. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just smiled. Tom's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. He had to be dreaming, or maybe he was hallucinating. But no matter how many times he blinked, she remained there, standing on the opposite shore, her hollow eyes locked on him. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. In an instant, the woman vanished into thin air, her form dissolving like smoke in the mist. Tom's heart lurched in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight, his mind reeling. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scanned the riverbank, searching for any sign of her. But there was nothing. No footprints, no ripple in the water. She was gone? For a long moment, Tom stood frozen in place, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. He couldn't make sense of what he had just seen. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was impossible, that ghosts weren't real, that the woman had been a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, in the pit of his stomach, he knew better. He had seen her. He had seen her eyes that twisted smile, and he knew without a doubt that it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. Too real. He staggered back from the river's edge, his breath coming in shaky gasps. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, but he couldn't think. All he knew was that he needed to get out of there. Now. Without another glance at the river, Tom turned and ran, his boots slipping in the mud as he sprinted back toward the village. The darkness seemed to press in around him, suffocating him, as if the very air had grown thick with the presence of something unseen, something watching him. When he finally reached his quarters, he slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He collapsed onto the bed, his heart still racing. The image of the woman's smile burned into his mind. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, that horrible, twisted grin. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the encounter over and over, trying to find some explanation, some logical reason for what he had seen. But there was none. The night dragged on, and Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his body tense with fear and unease. The old man's warning echoed in his mind, a grim reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the village's borders. "She'll come for you," the old man had said, "just like she came for me the morning after." When the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, Tom rose from the bed, his body aching from a night of restless sleep. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake the lingering feeling of dread that clung to him like a shadow. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the woman's face, the way she had vanished. As he stepped outside, the village was already buzzing with activity. But it wasn't the normal hum of daily life. There was an edge to the air, a tension that made the villagers move quickly, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Tom's stomach twisted. Something had happened. He approached a small group of villagers huddled near the edge of the riverbank. Their voices were low, anxious, as they whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances at something on the ground. "What's going on?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. One of the men turned to him, his face ashen. "There's been a discovery," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the river. Tom followed the man's gaze, and his heart plummeted into his stomach. Lying on the ground, just a few feet from the river's edge, was a body. A young woman, her dress soaked with mud, her long hair matted against her pale skin. But it wasn't the sight of the body that made Tom's blood run cold. It was the fact that her head was missing. Tom staggered back, bile rising in his throat as the world seemed to spin around him. The woman, the one he had seen just hours earlier, was dead. And her body lay before him, her lifeless form twisted in the same white dress he had seen the night before. A wave of nausea swept over him as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman he had seen by the river had been real. But now she was dead, and her head was gone. The villagers murmured among themselves, their voices filled with fear and confusion. But Tom could barely hear them. His mind was a whirlwind of horror and disbelief, his body numb with shock. Had he seen her before she died? Or had he seen her spirit, her ghost, moments after her death? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. The nightmare had only just begun. Part 3. A darker presence. The village lay shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog, the air heavy with the dampness of the recent rain. The once vibrant jungle around it had grown eerily quiet, as though even nature itself had retreated in fear. After the discovery of the headless girl's body, an unsettling sense of dread had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. No one spoke openly about it, but it was there in the way people glanced over their shoulders, the way they hurried indoors before dusk, and the way the children, once playful and carefree, now clung tightly to their mothers, eyes wide with unspoken terror. Tom felt the weight of it pressing down on him, a relentless knot in his gut that never seemed to ease. He had tried to push the memory of the girl's apparition out of his mind, tried to convince himself that his encounter with her by the river had been a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion. But with each passing day, the tension in the village grew, and with it, so did his unease. It had been 3 days since the girl's body was found, and already whispers of something far worse had begun to circulate. The locals spoke in hushed tones about dark spirits, ancient curses, and things best left undisturbed. They avoided the riverbank entirely now, crossing themselves when they walked too close to the water's edge. Even the bravest among them dared not linger near the spot where her body had been found, afraid of what might be lurking just beyond their sight. And then it happened again. A second death. Tom had been sitting outside his quarters, trying to shake off the restless feeling that had taken root in his chest. He was cleaning his rifle, the familiar routine a welcome distraction from the unease gnawing at his thoughts. The sky overhead was an oppressive grey, the thick clouds threatening another downpour. The village around him seemed unnaturally still. That was when the scream shattered the silence. It was a sound unlike anything Tom had ever heard, high-pitched, raw, filled with such unimaginable terror that it sent a bolt of fear straight through his spine. He leapt to his feet, heart hammering, and sprinted toward the source of the noise. As he rounded the corner of one of the huts, he saw a crowd gathering near the edge of the village. People were shouting, their voices overlapping in a chaotic jumble of panic and disbelief. Pushing his way through the throng, Tom's stomach clenched as he saw what they were all staring at. Another body. It was a man this time, one of the village hunters. He lay sprawled in the dirt, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his clothes soaked in blood, but it was the state of his body that made Tom's skin crawl. The man's chest had been torn open, his ribs cracked and splayed outward like the broken shell of some horrific creature. His face was frozen in a grimace of pain, his eyes wide and unseeing, as though the last moments of his life had been filled with unspeakable horror. A wave of nausea swept over Tom, and he had to force himself to look away. The smell of blood and death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the damp earth. Around him, the villagers murmured in fear, some of them clutching their children, others crossing themselves in a desperate attempt to ward off the evil that had befallen them. "Disease. Unnatural," someone whispered. Tom glanced toward the speaker, an elderly man who looked as though he'd seen his share of death. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "This isn't the work of any animal. No man should die like this." Tom felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He didn't need anyone to tell him that this was no ordinary killing. The brutality of it was unlike anything he had ever seen, more vicious, more deliberate. Whoever or whatever had done this hadn't just wanted to kill. It had wanted to maim, to destroy, to leave behind a message of terror. A deep sense of unease settled over him. Something was wrong in this village. Something far darker than anyone was willing to admit. The suspicion of Kyo. As the villagers tried to comprehend the horror before them, Tom couldn't help but notice one man standing apart from the others, watching with an unsettling calm. His name was Keo, a young soldier who had arrived in the village only a few weeks ago, shortly after Tom's own unit had taken up residence near the Cambodian border. There was something about Keo that had always rubbed Tom the wrong way, something cold and calculating in the way he carried himself, as though he were always watching, always waiting. Keo had hardly spoken to anyone since he'd arrived, keeping mostly to himself, but his presence had not gone unnoticed. The villagers regarded him with a mixture of wariness and suspicion, though none dared voice it aloud. Tom had seen the way they crossed to the other side of the street when Keo walked by, the way their conversation seemed to die off whenever he was near. It was as though they sensed something off about him, something that set him apart from the rest. As Tom's gaze flickered toward Keo now, he felt a chill creep up his spine. The young soldier stood at the edge of the crowd, his dark eyes fixed on the mutilated body with a disturbing lack of emotion. While everyone else recoiled in horror, Keo seemed almost detached, as though the sight before him was nothing out of the ordinary. It was the way he looked at the body unblinking, unmoved, that sent a shiver of unease through Tom. Keo's expression was unreadable, his face a mask of indifference. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and calculating, that made Tom's pulse quicken with a sudden, irrational fear. He's seen this before, Tom thought. The idea planted itself in his mind with chilling certainty. Keo wasn't shocked by the violence, wasn't even disturbed by it. He was familiar with it. Too familiar. As the villagers murmured among themselves, voices rising in fear and confusion, Tom stepped closer to Keo, studying the man's face. There was no trace of fear there, no sign of the terror that gripped everyone else. Instead, Keo's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, a gesture so subtle that Tom almost missed it. Almost. Tom's blood ran cold. A sickening realization washed over him, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Keo wasn't just a bystander. He was connected to these deaths. Somehow, in some way, the young soldier was involved. But how? Growing paranoia. That night, as the village was blanketed in darkness, Tom found it impossible to sleep. He lay awake in his cot, his mind racing, the memory of Keo's cold, emotionless stare seared into his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the brutalized bodies, their faces frozen in terror, their lives snuffed out in such horrific ways. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Keo than met their eyes, something darker, more dangerous than anyone realized. And yet, there was no proof, nothing to tie Keo directly to the murders, nothing to justify Tom's growing paranoia. But his gut told him otherwise. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was screaming that Keo was dangerous. But what could he do? He couldn't exactly go around accusing a fellow soldier of being involved in a string of supernatural murders, especially not without evidence. The others would think he'd lost his mind, and for all he knew, maybe he had. Maybe the stress of the war and the isolation of the jungle were finally taking their toll on him. But deep down, he knew this was no simple case of paranoia. There was something evil at work here, something that defied explanation. And Tom had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, Keo was at the center of it. The darkness spreads. The next morning the village was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of daily life, the clatter of pots, the chatter of women at the well, the laughter of children were absent. Instead, the villagers moved about in silence, their faces drawn and pale, as though they were living under the shadow of some unseen horror. Tom kept his distance from Keo, but he watched him closely. The young soldier seemed unaffected by the growing tension in the village, moving through the streets with the same cold indifference as always. But there was something different now, something that made Tom's skin crawl whenever Keo was near. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there, a sense of malevolence, an aura of darkness that seemed to cling to Keo like a second skin. Part 4. A horrifying discovery. The thick jungle lay sprawled in front of Tom, an impenetrable wall of twisted trees and dense foliage that seemed to breathe with its own life. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the oppressive humidity making it hard to catch a full breath. Above him, the sky was a heavy blanket of dark clouds, concealing the moon and casting the world below into an almost impenetrable gloom. It was as if the very jungle conspired to keep secrets, to guard whatever horrors lay within its tangled heart. Tom's grip on the knife in his hand tightened as he silently pushed through the underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest, its rhythm quick and erratic, every thump resonating with the fear clawing at his insides. Kyo had been acting strange for days, and after the discovery of the second mutilated body, Tom had become certain that Kyo was hiding something terrible. Kyo had left the village under the cover of night, moving quickly and without a word to anyone. Tom had followed at a distance, careful to remain hidden, his instincts screaming at him that this was more than just a routine patrol. There was something in Kyo's movements, something deliberate and almost ritualistic. He moved with a purpose that set Tom's nerves on edge. The jungle had always felt eerie at night, but tonight it felt alive with malevolent energy. Shadows danced and twisted in ways that made Tom's skin crawl, and every rustle of the leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, as if the jungle itself was aware of his presence. And then there was the sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. It was as if the jungle was breathing, whispering dark secrets that were never meant for human ears. Tom stopped suddenly, his breath catching in his throat. Up ahead, through the thick curtain of leaves, he saw a faint flickering light. It was dim, almost too weak to notice, but unmistakable in the pitch black of the jungle night. The light danced and wavered like fire, but its eerie greenish glow sent a chill down Tom's spine. His heart pounded faster, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he crouched low, moving cautiously closer. Through the thick foliage, Tom saw him. Kyo stood in a small clearing, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the flames that licked at the ground. He was alone, his back to Tom, but something about the way he stood rigid, almost inhumanly still, made Tom's breath catch. Kyo wasn't just standing there, he was chanting. The words were low, guttural, and foreign. They didn't sound like any language Tom had ever heard before, but there was something profoundly unsettling about them. They seemed to vibrate in the air, thick and heavy with malice, as though they were being drawn from the very bowels of the earth itself. Tom's heart raced. He knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But his legs felt rooted to the spot, his body paralyzed with dread. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. Kyo knelt slowly by the fire, his hands moving with precise, practiced motions. He reached into a satchel at his side and withdrew something, a small object, that glinted in the dim light of the fire. Tom squinted, trying to see, but it wasn't until Kyo held the object up to the sky that Tom's blood ran cold. It was a human skull. The skull was old, its surface yellowed and cracked, but Tom could see that it had been intricately carved with strange arcane symbols. The markings seemed to pulse in the light of the fire, glowing faintly as Kyo held the skull aloft, his chant rising in pitch and intensity. Tom's stomach churned. This was no ordinary soldier. Kyo wasn't just performing some strange ritual, he was summoning something. Tom had heard of dark magic, the kind that villagers whispered about in fear, the kind that was said to belong to ancient, forbidden practices. But seeing it with his own eyes, witnessing the dark energy that seemed to hum in the air around Kyo, made his skin crawl. Suddenly the flames around Kyo flared brighter, casting long, twisted shadows across the jungle floor. The temperature in the air dropped sharply, and Tom felt an icy chill creep up his spine, as though something cold and malevolent had entered the clearing. He watched in horror as the ground beneath the fire began to shift and stir, as though something was moving beneath the earth. Kyo's chant grew louder, his voice reverberating through the clearing with unnatural force. The earth trembled, and Tom could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the low rumble of something ancient and powerful awakening. His heart pounded wildly in his chest as he watched the ground split open with a sickening crack, the fire flaring even brighter as it did. Then, From the gaping fissure in the earth, something began to emerge. At first it was just a shadow, a dark, writhing mass that seemed to ooze from the ground like liquid. But as it rose higher, Tom's stomach clenched with fear. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a form, vaguely human in shape, but grotesquely twisted and distorted, as though its limbs had been pulled and stretched in unnatural directions. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was a sickly, translucent grey, and its eyes were nothing more than empty, hollow pits that glowed faintly with the same eerie green light as the fire. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the creature's head turned slowly, its hollow eyes fixing on Kyo. The young soldier continued his chant, his face eerily calm as the creature rose fully from the ground, its misshapen body towering over him. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as though it wasn't quite in control of its limbs. Tom felt bile rise in his throat. Whatever Kyo had summoned, it wasn't just a spirit, it was something far darker, far more dangerous, and Kyo was controlling it. The creature knelt before Kyo, its grotesque form looming over the young soldier like a nightmare made flesh. Kyo's chant slowed, his voice lowering to a near whisper as he extended his hand toward the creature. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a low guttural sound that made Tom's skin crawl, the creature bent its head and pressed its hand to the ground, as though submitting to Kyo's will. Tom's mind reeled. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Kyo wasn't just a soldier. He was a necromancer, someone who could control the dead, someone who could summon dark, twisted spirits from the underworld. The thought made Tom's blood run cold. What kind of power did Kyo hold, and what was he planning to do with it? The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was afraid of what Kyo had unleashed. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched lower, his hand shaking as he gripped the hilt of his knife. He knew he should run, that he should leave this cursed place before Kyo discovered him. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, his eyes locked on the horrifying scene in front of him. And then, without warning, Kyo's head snapped around, his dark eyes locking onto Tom's hiding place in the trees. Tom froze. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still, the air thick with the weight of unspoken terror. Kyo's expression didn't change. There was no surprise, no fear, just the same cold, calculating look he always wore. But in that moment, Tom knew that Kyo had sensed him. The creature by Kyo's side let out a low, inhuman growl, its hollow eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air. Tom's heart lurched in his chest as he realized, with growing dread, that the creature could sense him too. It turned its twisted head toward him, its body tensing as it prepared to spring. Panic surged through Tom's veins, his mind racing. He couldn't let Kyo know he had seen this. Whatever dark magic Kyo was using, it was more powerful than anything Tom had ever encountered, and the thought of what Kyo might do to him if he knew he had been discovered sent a wave of terror crashing over him. Without thinking, Tom bolted. The jungle erupted around him as he sprinted through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his ears. Branches whipped at his face and arms, and the ground beneath his feet was uneven and treacherous, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He could hear the creature behind him, its twisted limbs crashing through the foliage as it pursued him with unnatural speed. Tom's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought to stay ahead of the monster. He could hear its guttural growls growing louder, could feel the cold, malevolent presence of the creature as it closed in on him. But he didn't dare look back. He could see the village up ahead, the faint lights of the huts flickering through the trees. If he could just make it there, if he could just reach the safety of the village. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his leg, and Tom stumbled, his body crashing to the ground with a thud. He gasped in pain, his vision swimming as he struggled to push himself back to his feet. But it was too late. The creature was almost upon him. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror as the creature's grotesque form loomed over him. Its hollow eyes glowed with an eerie green light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque, almost human smile. And then, just as the creature lunged forward, There was a deafening crack of gunshot. The creature stopped, its body jerking violently as a dark, oozing liquid spilled from its chest. Tom blinked in shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. From the trees, one of Tom's fellow soldiers stepped forward, his rifle still smoking. "Come on," the soldier said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get back to the village," Tom nodded, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear as he allowed the soldier to help him to his feet. But even as they hurried back to the village, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Kyo knew. And whatever dark power Kyo had unleashed, Tom knew it wouldn't be long before the darkness came for him again. Part 5. The Confrontation. The jungle was a living, breathing entity around Tom as he crept back toward the village, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed. His heart raced, the images of Kyo's dark ritual still seared into his mind, the grotesque figure that had risen from the earth, the unnatural chanting. Whatever Kyo was doing, it wasn't just dangerous, it was evil. Tom's instinct screamed at him to leave, to warn the others, but something deep within him, something primal, told him that Kyo already knew he had been spying. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush, but the dense foliage seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with its oppressive weight. The jungle had grown silent, too silent, as if it too was waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, out of nowhere, a cold voice pierced the quiet night. "You shouldn't have come here." Tom froze. His heart pounded so hard in his chest, he thought it might burst. Slowly he turned toward the voice, dread clawing at his insides. Kyo stood behind him, just a few yards away, his figure barely visible in the dim moonlight that filtered through the trees. His face was shadowed, but Tom could see the glint of something dark and sinister in his eyes, something not entirely human. Tom swallowed hard, trying to keep his breathing steady, but fear gripped him like a vice. "Kyo," he said, his voice low and strained, "I don't know what you're doing, but it has to stop." A slow, twisted smile crept across Kyo's face, one that sent icy tendrils of terror down Tom's spine. "Stop," he repeated mockingly. "You think you understand what's happening here, Tom? You think you can stop this?" There was something unnatural about his voice, a deeper, raspier tone that didn't belong to Kyo. Tom's gut twisted. It was as if Kyo was speaking, but not entirely in control. Something else was pulling the strings. "Whatever this is," Tom said, trying to sound braver than he felt, "you need help. Let's go back to the village. We can figure this out." Kyo laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed through the jungle like a nightmare. "Help," he spat. "You still don't get it, do you?" Suddenly, without warning, Kyo lunged forward, moving with inhuman speed. Tom barely had time to react as Kyo's fist slammed into his chest with bone-shattering force, sending him flying backward into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, all Tom could do was gasp for air, his lungs burning as he struggled to breathe. Kyo loomed over him, his eyes gleaming with something dark and malevolent. His face was contorted in a snarl, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed sharper, more animalistic. Tom blinked, trying to shake the fog from his mind, but the pain in his chest was overwhelming. He knew he was in trouble. Kyo grabbed Tom by the collar, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. His strength was unnatural, far beyond what any normal man should have. Tom could see the dark veins pulsing beneath Kyo's skin, as though something was surging through him, giving him this monstrous power. "Kyo, stop!" Tom choked out, trying to wrestle free from his grip, but it was no use. Kyo was far stronger than he had ever imagined. "You don't understand," Kyo growled, his voice a guttural rasp that barely sounded human anymore. "I am no longer bound by the rules of your pathetic world." With a savage snarl, Kyo threw Tom across the clearing like he was nothing more than a ragdoll. Tom's body hit the ground hard, pain flaring through his ribs as he rolled to a stop. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony, but he knew he couldn't stay down. Not if he wanted to survive. Tom staggered to his feet, gasping for breath as he wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. His heart pounded furiously, adrenaline coursing through his veins, fueling his desperation. He knew Kyo was no longer fully human, not anymore. Whatever dark power had taken hold of him, it was consuming him from the inside out. But Tom wasn't going down without a fight. "You've lost your mind, Kyo," Tom spat, his voice shaking with anger. "This thing, whatever it is not you. It's controlling you." Kyo laughed again, a sound that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. Controlling me, he said, his voice laced with mockery. No, Tom. It has freed me. Tom barely had time to react before Kyo was on him again, his movements fast and brutal. Kyo's fist connected with Tom's jaw, sending him stumbling backward, but Tom managed to stay on his feet. The world spun around him, and he tasted blood in his mouth, but he clenched his fists, refusing to let the fear take over. Kyo advanced on him, his expression a mask of twisted rage. His body seemed to pulse with dark energy, and Tom could see the shadows shifting around him, as if they were alive, writhing and coiling like serpents. Every instinct told Tom to run, but there was nowhere to go. Kyo was too fast, too strong. With a roar, Kyo charged at Tom again, but this time Tom was ready. He sidestepped at the last moment, using Kyo's momentum against him. Kyo stumbled, caught off guard, and Tom seized the opportunity. He swung his knife in a desperate arc, the blade slashing across Kyo's arm. Kyo let out a snarl of pain, but instead of retreating, he grinned. Blood dripped from the wound, but the dark energy swirling around him seemed to seep into the cut, knitting the flesh back together almost instantly. Tom's eyes widened in horror. What the hell? Kyo wiped the blood from his arm, his grin widening. You can't kill me, Tommy said, his voice a low, menacing growl. Not anymore, Tom's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of panic and disbelief. Kyo wasn't just stronger, he was healing. Whatever dark magic had taken hold of him, it had made him nearly invincible. Tom's chances of survival were shrinking by the second. Kyo lunged at him again, faster than Tom could react. He grabbed Tom by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. Tom's vision blurred as Kyo's grip tightened, cutting off his air supply. You should have stayed out of this, Kyo hissed, his eyes glowing with malevolent energy. Now, you'll die with the rest of them. Tom's vision darkened, the edges of his sight going fuzzy as he struggled to breathe. His hands clawed at Kyo's wrist, but it was like trying to pry open a steel vise. Desperation surged through him, panic clawing at his insides as his lungs burned for air. In a last-ditch effort, Tom brought his knee up, slamming it into Kyo's ribs with as much force as he could muster. Kyo grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Tom to gasp for breath. Seizing the opportunity, Tom swung his knife again, this time aiming for Kyo's side. The blade sank into flesh, and Kyo howled in pain, stumbling backward. Tom hit the ground hard, coughing and gasping for air, as his vision slowly cleared. He could feel the bruises forming around his neck where Kyo's fingers had dug into his skin, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. Kyo ripped the knife from his side, his face twisted in fury. You think you can hurt me, he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. You think your pathetic weapons can stop me. Tom scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but every option seemed futile. Kyo was too powerful, too fast, and whatever was controlling him, it wasn't human. Kyo charged at him again, his eyes blazing with hatred. Tom barely managed to dodge the attack, but Kyo was relentless. He swung his fists with brutal force, each blow aimed to kill. Tom ducked, feeling the rush of air as Kyo's fist sailed past his head. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another strike, but Kyo was on him in an instant. This time, Kyo's hand found its mark, grabbing Tom by the arm and twisting it behind his back with savage strength. Tom cried out in pain as his shoulder wrenched in its socket, but Kyo didn't let up. He slammed Tom into a tree, pinning him against the rough bark with his full weight. Tom's vision blurred again, his head spinning from the impact. You're weak, Tom, Kyo growled, his voice barely human now. You can't win. Tom gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body screaming in agony. But he couldn't give up. He wouldn't give Kyo the satisfaction. With a burst of adrenaline, Tom pushed back with all his strength, throwing his elbow into Kyo's side. Kyo grunted, his grip loosening, just enough for Tom to slip free. He stumbled forward, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind was clouded with pain and fear, but he knew one thing for sure: Kyo was no longer just a man. Something far darker had taken hold of him, and Tom didn't know how much longer he could survive. Kyo wiped the blood from his mouth, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I've waited for this moment, Tommy said, his voice low and dangerous. You have no idea what's coming, Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he braced himself for the next attack. Part 6. The Amulet's Power. The night in the jungle was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of Tom's ragged breathing and Kyo's maniacal laughter. The confrontation between them had escalated beyond what Tom could have imagined, his body aching, bruised and battered by Kyo's inhuman strength. Tom struggled to stay on his feet, each breath burning in his chest. Blood trickled down his face and his vision blurred, but the fire of survival still burned deep within him. Kyo stood across from him, grinning like a predator who had cornered his prey. His eyes gleamed with a malevolent glow, his body radiating with an unnatural energy that pulsed through the dark air around them. The shadows writhed at his feet as though alive, twisting and coiling like serpents, responding to the dark force that had consumed him. Tom's mind raced. Every instinct told him this wasn't just a man standing before him. Kyo had become something else entirely, something twisted by a power beyond this world. And that power was about to crush him. "You can't win," Tom Kyo sneered, his voice a guttural rasp. "You're just delaying the inevitable." Tom's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give him an advantage. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles raw from the earlier blows. But even as the reality of his situation sank in, a flicker of hope emerged from the recesses of his memory. The amulet. It hung around his neck, the small, unassuming charm that the old man had given him back in the village, warning him that it might protect him from the dark forces that lurked in the jungle. At the time, Tom hadn't fully believed in such things. But now, facing down a possessed soldier who had harnessed dark magic, Tom wasn't willing to dismiss anything. Kyo's twisted smile faltered as Tom's hand drifted toward his chest, where the amulet rested beneath his torn shirt. His fingers curled around it, feeling the cold, smooth surface of the charm. A strange warmth radiated from the amulet, a pulse that synced with Tom's racing heartbeat. "I don't need to win," Tom muttered, his voice hoarse. "I just need to survive." With that, he yanked the amulet from beneath his shirt, holding it out in front of him. The moment the amulet touched the open air, a strange force surged through the clearing. The shadows around Kyo recoiled as if struck, and Kyo's eyes widened in shock. What are you doing?" Kyo growled, his voice shaking for the first time since the fight began. He took a step back, his confidence wavering. Tom held the amulet higher, watching as the dark tendrils of energy surrounding Kyo began to flicker, as if disturbed by the presence of the charm. The air grew colder, and a faint glow emanated from the amulet, casting a soft, golden light across the ground. Kyo's expression twisted into a snarl. "That won't save you," he roared, charging at Tom with renewed fury. But this time, Tom was ready. He gripped the amulet tightly and thrust it forward, directly into Kyo's path. The moment the amulet's light touched Kyo, his body convulsed violently, and he let out a scream so full of pain and terror that it chilled Tom to the bone. Kyo stumbled back, clutching his chest as dark tendrils of energy erupted from his skin like writhing snakes, thrashing and twisting as if they were alive. "No," Kyo howled, his voice filled with agony. "No, this can't be happening." Tom watched in disbelief as the shadows that had once obeyed Kyo now turned against him. They lashed out, striking at his body with violent force, tearing at his flesh like ravenous beasts. The dark energy that had made Kyo nearly invincible was now ripping him apart from the inside. Kyo fell to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably as the spirits he had summoned turned on him. His eyes, once glowing with power, now flickered with fear. His skin began to blister and crack, blackened by the dark energy that was devouring him. "Stop!" Kyo screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. "Stop this!" But there was no stopping it. Whatever dark force Kyo had harnessed, whatever pact he had made with the spirits, it was now out of his control. The spirits were exacting their price, and they had chosen to consume him. Tom could only watch as Kyo's body twisted and contorted, his face a mask of terror and pain. His skin seemed to peel away in layers, revealing the dark, writhing shadows beneath. The air around him crackled with unnatural energy, and the jungle itself seemed to groan in protest as the spirits raged. Kyo's screams grew louder, more frantic, until they became an inhuman wail, a sound that echoed through the jungle like the cry of a dying beast. His body convulsed one last time, and then, with a final, shuddering gasp, he collapsed to the ground. For a moment there was only silence. Tom stood frozen, his hand still gripping the amulet as he stared at Keo's lifeless body. The dark energy that had once surrounded Keo was gone, leaving only a faint, lingering haze in the air. The shadows that had tormented him had dissipated, as if they had been banished by the amulet's light. Tom took a shaky breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He had seen men die before too many times. In fact, but this was different. This wasn't just death. This was something far darker, far more terrifying. The jungle around him remained eerie silent, as if the spirits themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Tom's legs felt weak, his body heavy with exhaustion, but he forced himself to move, to step forward and approach Keo's still form. Keo's body lay twisted on the ground, his face frozen in a grotesque expression of horror. His skin was marred with dark, vein-like lines that crisscrossed his flesh, remnants of the dark magic that had consumed him. His once vibrant eyes were dull, lifeless. Tom crouched down, staring at the amulet in his hand. The glow had faded now, but the warmth remained, a steady, reassuring pulse against his skin. Whatever magic the old man had imbued into this charm, it had saved Tom's life. But it had also unleashed something far more powerful, something that had destroyed Keo. Tom reached out hesitantly, touching Keo's shoulder. It was cold, unnaturally cold, as if the life had been sucked out of him long before his body had fallen. The spirits were gone, but the weight of their presence still lingered in the air, oppressive and suffocating. Tom knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever dark forces Keo had called upon were still out there, still watching, still waiting. He stood up slowly, his body trembling from exhaustion and the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. He had survived, but just barely. The amulet had protected him this time, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the next encounter might not go as well. The jungle around him began to stir again, the sounds of the night slowly creeping back in. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of an animal, the wind whispering through the trees. But Tom couldn't relax. Not yet. He glanced down at Keo's body one last time before turning away, his mind racing. He had to get back to the village. He had to warn them, tell them what had happened, what Keo had become. There was no telling how far the darkness had spread, how many others might be affected. As Tom made his way through the jungle, his grip tightened around the amulet. It was his only defense against the darkness that now stopped him, and he wasn't about to let it go. The old man's words echoed in his mind, a warning that now felt all too real. The spirits in these lands are ancient, powerful. They don't care about human life, they crave something more. Tom's jaw clenched as he pushed forward, the amulet's warmth his only comfort in the oppressive darkness. But as he moved through the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and for the first time since the fight had ended, Tom felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. The spirits might have turned on Keo, but that didn't mean they were done. Not by a long shot. And as the shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, Tom knew this was just the beginning. Part 7. Keo's Demise. The air around Tom was thick with tension, crackling with the oppressive weight of dark magic as the wind howled through the dense trees. The jungle, once eerie quiet, now seemed to pulse with the presence of ancient spirits, angry and restless. Their whispers echoed through the night, swirling in the shadows like a warning, or perhaps a curse. Tom's hand shook as he held the amulet out in front of him, his knuckles white with strain. The small, unassuming charm hung from a tattered string, but in this moment it felt like the only thing tethering him to life. He could feel its warmth, a strange and pulsing energy that vibrated through his bones. It was his only defense against the growing darkness that had consumed Keo. Across from him, Keo snarled like a cornered animal, his once human form distorted by the malevolent forces he had summoned. His skin was slick with sweat, the veins beneath his flesh pulsing black as the dark magic fought for control of him. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now glowed with a sickening, ethereal light, demonic and otherworldly. Kyo was no longer the man Tom had known. He was something far worse. "You think this will stop me?" Kyo's voice was a guttural rasp, barely recognizable beneath the twisted growl that reverberated from his throat. His lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, bloody teeth. "You're a fool if you think that amulet can save you now." Tom's heart raced as he felt the full weight of Kyo's gaze, his eyes burning with hatred, with a hunger for destruction. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, as though the very earth itself feared what was about to unfold. Tom knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if he failed here, if he lost this fight, it wouldn't just be his life that was taken. The jungle would never be the same again. Kyo lunged forward, his movements unnaturally fast, like a beast possessed by something far darker than human rage. His fingers were claws now, twisted and sharp, and they reached for Tom's throat with the intent to tear him apart. Tom acted on instinct. With a guttural roar of his own, he thrust the amulet toward Kyo, pressing it into his chest just as Kyo's clawed hand scraped across his arm, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. The moment the amulet made contact with Kyo's skin, the jungle exploded with a blinding, golden light. Kyo screamed a sound that was not human, a wail of pure agony that echoed through the trees like the howling of 1,000 tortured souls. His body convulsed violently as the amulet's power coursed through him, searing his flesh and burning through the darkness that had taken root in his soul. The shadows that clung to him recoiled, writhing and twisting as if trying to escape the purifying light that now radiated from the charm. Tom could feel the energy in the amulet intensifying, growing hotter in his hand, as though the spirits that had protected him were now fighting against Kyo's hold on this world. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched Kyo's face contort with pain, his once arrogant sneer now replaced by a mask of terror. His skin blistered and cracked beneath the amulet's power, dark veins turning to ash as they were consumed by the light. "No!" Kyo shrieked, his voice a desperate, inhuman screech. His body jerked violently as the dark energy inside him rebelled, trying to claw its way free. His arms flailed, his claws digging into the earth, as though he could somehow anchor himself to the physical world, but it was no use. The amulet's power was too strong, and the spirits he had once controlled now turned against him with a vengeance. Tom staggered backward, his body trembling with exhaustion, as Kyo's convulsions grew more violent. The darkness that had surrounded him now flowed like smoke, dissipating into the night as the jungle itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Kyo's screams grew louder, more desperate, his eyes wide with panic as he realized that he had lost control. The ground around them began to tremble, and the air was thick with the scent of burning flesh. Kyo's body was alight now, his skin bubbling and melting under the heat of the amulet's energy. The spirits that had once obeyed his command now swirled around him like vultures, their ghostly forms clawing at his body, ripping him apart from the inside. Kyo's eyes rolled back into his head, his mouth twisted open in a silent scream as his body was consumed by the very forces he had sought to control. Tom could feel the weight of the jungle pressing in on him, the spirits watching, waiting. He held his breath as Kyo's body jerked one last time, then collapsed to the ground in a heap of ash and bone. The light from the amulet dimmed, its warmth fading as the jungle grew still once more. For a long, harrowing moment, there was only silence. Tom stood frozen, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hand still clutched the amulet, its surface now cool to the touch, as if the energy it had unleashed had burned itself out. He blinked, his vision swimming, as he took in the sight of Kyo's lifeless body, what little was left of it. The once formidable soldier was now nothing more than a crumpled heap of charred remains, his body twisted and broken by the very forces he had once commanded. Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry as he tried to process what had just happened. He had seen death before too many times, but this was something else. Kyo had been consumed by his own ambition, his desire for power, and the spirits he had thought he could control had turned on him, devouring him from the inside out. It was a fate worse than death. The jungle, once filled with the howling of spirits, and the crackle of dark magic now seemed almost serene. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and ash. Tom staggered forward, his legs trembling beneath him as he approached what remained of Keo. The shadows that had once clung to him were gone, leaving only a hollow shell behind. Keo's eyes were wide and unseeing, his mouth frozen in a final, silent scream. His body, twisted and blackened, was a grotesque reminder of the power he had tried to wield. Tom crouched down beside Keo, his heart pounding in his chest. His fingers brushed against the charred remains of Keo's uniform, the fabric crumbling under his touch. There was no trace of the man Keo had once been, only the monster he had become. Tom's hand tightened around the amulet as he stood, his mind racing. The old man had been right, the spirits of this land were ancient and powerful, far beyond anything a mortal could control. Keo had paid the ultimate price for his arrogance, and Tom had barely escaped with his life. As the wind whispered through the trees, Tom took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. He had survived, but at what cost? The jungle was still alive with the presence of spirits, and though Keo was gone, Tom knew that the darkness had not been fully vanquished. With one last glance at Keo's lifeless body, Tom turned and began to make his way back through the jungle. His steps were slow, heavy with exhaustion, and the knowledge that his fight was far from over. The amulet hung around his neck, its warmth a constant reminder of the power it held and the danger it had protected him from. As Tom disappeared into the shadows of the jungle, the spirits that had once swirled around Keo now drifted aimlessly, their purpose lost. The jungle was quiet once more, but the echoes of the battle lingered, a reminder of the dark forces that still lurked in the shadows. And as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, the jungle held its breath, waiting for the next battle to come. The amulet had saved Tom's life, but the war with the spirits was far from over. Part 8. The Haunting Aftermath. Tom stood amidst the stillness of the jungle, his breath ragged and shallow, his chest heaving with the effort it had taken to survive. His body was a patchwork of pain, deep cuts, bruises, and the exhaustion that came not only from the physical fight, but from battling something far more sinister than the enemy he had ever faced. The supernatural forces that had gripped Keo and the village still hung in the air like a thick fog, unseen but unmistakable. It was over, but at what cost? The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The once ferocious jungle, now silent in the aftermath of the battle, seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind, which had earlier howled through the trees with a fury of its own, had died down to a ghostly whisper. There was an eerie tranquility in the air, but it was the kind of stillness that follows after a storm, unnatural, unsettling. Tom's gaze lingered on the charred, lifeless body of Keo. What remained of him was barely recognizable as human, his flesh blackened and twisted, his face contorted in a final scream that would never be heard. Keo had been consumed by the very spirits he sought to control, a victim of his own dark ambitions. His demise was as terrifying as the power he had tried to wield. But it wasn't just Keo who had been affected by this dark magic. Tom could feel the weight of the battle settling heavily on his shoulders, pressing down on him like a burden too great to bear. Every breath he took was laced with the memories of what he had witnessed, the malevolent spirits, the dark rituals, the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of the physical world. He clenched the protective amulet in his fist, feeling its cool, steady pulse beneath his fingers. It had saved him, but the amulet also served as a reminder of everything he had just endured. The ancient magic that protected him had also marked him. He could feel it in his bones, in his very soul. The village may have been saved from the immediate threat, but Tom knew that the scars left behind, both seen and unseen, would haunt them all. His legs trembled beneath him, threatening to give way, but Tom forced himself to remain standing. He had to. The village depended on him now, though he wasn't sure how much he had left to give. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything, yet all he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of loss that filled the air. The village, how would they recover from this? The quiet hamlet nestled near the Cambodian border had been a place of refuge, but now it felt tainted by darkness. The supernatural battle had torn through the village like a violent storm, leaving behind devastation not just in the physical world, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Tom could still hear their screams of villagers' desperate cries for help as they realized something was terribly wrong. He had watched fear take hold of the people he had grown to know, as their peaceful lives had been shattered by the malevolent forces Kyo had unleashed. For the first time, Tom felt truly helpless. He had faced death before, in countless forms, but this was something far more terrifying. He remembered the old man's words from earlier that night, the warning that not all spirits could be fought, that not all battles would end in victory. As he stood over Kyo's mangled corpse, Tom understood the truth behind those words. The village had won the battle, but they had lost something far more valuable in the process. Their innocence, their sense of safety had been stripped away, replaced by an ever-present fear of what might come next. Tom's thoughts drifted to the villagers who had looked to him for protection. Could he face them now, after everything that had happened? Would they see him as a savior, or would they be consumed by the same fear that had gripped him throughout this nightmare? His body ached, each movement sending waves of pain shooting through his limbs, but the physical injuries paled in comparison to the emotional weight he carried. The jungle, once a place of life and vitality, now seemed to loom over him, oppressive and full of secrets. The spirits that had been summoned were no longer visible, but Tom could feel their presence lingering, watching from the shadows. He turned away from Kyo's body, unable to bear the sight any longer. The jungle path stretched out before him, winding through the darkness like a twisted, serpentine creature. Tom knew that returning to the village would be no easy task both physically and mentally. He wasn't sure if he had the strength left to face the villagers, to look into their eyes and explain what had happened. How could he tell them that the man they had trusted, the soldier who had been one of their own, had been the very cause of the nightmare they had lived through? The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Tom had been a soldier for years, had fought in wars, seen men die, and witnessed horrors beyond comprehension. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't a war between men. This was a war between the living and the dead, between the light and the shadows that had always lurked just beyond the edge of the world. As he walked, the jungle seemed to close in around him, the trees towering above like silent sentinels, watching his every step. Tom's footsteps were heavy, each one a reminder of the pain coursing through his body. His hand instinctively went to the deep gash across his arm, the wound still fresh from Kyo's attack. He winced, but continued forward, knowing that he couldn't stop not yet. When the village finally came into view, Tom paused. The familiar sight of the small homes and the flickering lights from within should have brought him comfort, but instead he felt a wave of dread wash over him. How could he return to them now, after everything that had happened? Would they blame him for the destruction? Would they fear him, knowing that he had fought against forces they couldn't even begin to comprehend? He took a deep breath and forced himself to move forward. The village was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of life replaced by an unsettling silence. The few villagers who were still awake looked at him with wide, haunted eyes, their faces pale and gaunt. They had seen too much. They had lived through horrors that no one should ever have to endure. As Tom entered the heart of the village, a small group of people gathered around him. Their faces were etched with fear and uncertainty, their eyes searching his for answers. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain the battle that had taken place, the dark magic that had claimed Kyo's life and nearly taken his own? A young woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" she asked, her eyes pleading for reassurance. Are we safe? Tom's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her yes, that the danger was gone, that they could return to their lives and forget the nightmare that had unfolded. But he couldn't lie to them. The truth weighed too heavily on his shoulders, and the haunting presence of the spirits still lingered in the air. "It's over for now," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "But we've all been touched by something far darker than we can understand." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. They had survived, but like Tom, they would never be the same. The events of that night had left deep scars that would not heal easily, if at all. The village had been changed forever, its people marked by the supernatural battle that had taken place. Tom's gaze swept over the crowd, and he saw the same haunted look in their eyes that he had seen in his own reflection. They had been through hell, and though the immediate threat had passed, the memories would linger, festering like an open wound. The jungle, once their home and their protector, had turned against them, revealing a darkness they had never imagined. How could they ever trust it again? A heavy silence fell over the village as Tom stood before them, a soldier who had fought not just for their lives but for their souls. He had survived, but he wasn't sure if that was a victory or a curse. The spirits that Theo had summoned, the dark forces that had nearly consumed them all, were still out there, waiting, watching. The weight of the amulet around his neck was a constant reminder of the battle he had fought, and the darkness that still lurked in the shadows. He had been given the power to fight back, but he knew that power came at a cost. The spirits were ancient, powerful, and relentless. They would not be easily vanquished. As the villagers began to disperse, Tom turned his gaze back to the jungle. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The night was quiet now, but Tom knew that the jungle held secrets that had been awakened by the darkness Keo had unleashed. He took a deep breath, his chest heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Tom had survived, but he knew that the haunting aftermath of what had happened would stay with him for the rest of his life. And as he stared into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting for their next move. Part 9. A life forever changed. The village lay quiet beneath the fading twilight as Tom trudged back, his body aching, his soul even more. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the physical wounds that throbbed across his battered frame, but because of the burden he now carried within him. His eyes, once sharp with the clarity of a soldier, now bore the weight of the supernatural horrors he had witnessed. The jungle, with its eerie silence, whispered of things no man should ever encounter. The spirits, the dark magic, and Theo's twisted transformation, it was all real. Too real. Tom had fought enemies before, but nothing like this. He had faced death on countless battlefields, but death that night had a different face, a spectral one. And though he had survived, he knew he would never be the same. As Tom reached the edge of the village, a cold wind stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt wood and damp earth. It reminded him of the night he first encountered the spirits, of the smell of Theo's charred body as the amulet burned through the dark forces that possessed him. The amulet, now warm in his hand, felt like a relic from another world, one of protection, yes, but also a reminder of the horrors he had barely escaped. The village itself was a shadow of its former self. The people who had once gone about their lives with quiet contentment now lived in a state of constant fear. Tom could see it in their eyes as they peeked from behind half-closed doors, as they whispered in hushed voices. They had survived, but they too had changed. Tom walked down the narrow dirt path, and the few villagers he passed stepped aside quickly, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They had heard the stories how Tom had fought against Keo, how he had confronted the spirits and emerged victorious. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know what Tom had seen, what he had felt, and how it haunted him now. A small group of villagers gathered near the central fire pit, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They looked up as Tom approached, their expressions somber, searching for reassurance. But Tom had none to give. His victory over Keo was hollow. The evil was gone for now, but the darkness it left behind lingered in every corner of the village. Tom, a man called out softly, stepping forward. It was the village elder, his face etched with deep lines of worry. Is it over? Are we truly safe? Tom wanted to lie, to offer them the comfort they desperately sought, but the truth was a far heavier thing to bear. He had seen what Kyo had become, what the spirits had done. He had felt the malevolent power coursing through the jungle, and he knew that such evil didn't simply vanish. It waited, biding its time. We're safe, Tom said, his voice steady, but the weight behind his words betrayed him. He couldn't meet the elder's eyes. For now the villagers exchanged uneasy glances, and Tom could feel their doubt. They were right to doubt. The battle had been won, but no one could know for how long. The village had been touched by forces beyond their understanding, and that kind of darkness left scars that wouldn't heal. As the villagers dispersed, returning to their homes, Tom found himself standing alone by the fire, its heat doing little to chase away the cold he felt deep inside. He closed his eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but instead, the memories flooded back with brutal clarity. He saw Kyo's face, twisted with rage and pain, as the spirits consumed him. He heard the guttural screams as Kyo's flesh burned beneath the power of the amulet, his body convulsing in agony. And then the silence. The dreadful, final silence as Kyo's body collapsed, lifeless, leaving only ash and the scent of death in the air. Tom opened his eyes, staring into the fire, as if the flames could somehow cleanse him of these memories. But nothing could erase what he had seen. The supernatural battle had torn to his soul, leaving behind a hollow, haunted shell. He turned and began walking toward the small hut that had been his home for the past few months. The village had been a refuge for him, a place to escape the horrors of war. But now it was a place that bore new nightmares once that he couldn't leave behind, no matter how far he traveled. Inside the hut, the air was thick with stillness. Tom sat on the rough-hewn bed, his hands trembling slightly as he set the amulet on the wooden table beside him. It glimmered faintly in the dim light, a strange, otherworldly glow that reminded him of the old man who had given it to him. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. Not all spirits can be fought. Some battles will leave you scarred forever. Tom understood now, more than ever, what those words meant. He had fought the spirits, yes, but they had left their mark on him. He would never be the same. The shadows that lingered in the corners of his vision, the whispers that filled his dreams, they were all part of the price he had paid for survival. Tom leaned forward, resting his head in his hands, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, grief for the lives lost, anger at the evil that had touched this place, and a deep, overwhelming sadness that clung to him like a second skin. The faces of the villagers flashed in his mind. Those who had trusted him, looked to him for protection. He had saved them, but at what cost? The village was forever changed, and so was he. Suddenly, a noise from outside broke through his thoughts. Tom tensed, his instinct sharp despite his exhaustion. He rose to his feet, moving to the door and peering out into the darkness. A figure stood at the edge of the jungle, barely visible in the fading light. For a moment, Tom's heart raced, fear clawing at his throat. Was it one of the spirits come back for him? Or perhaps Kyo, risen from the dead, his malevolent power even stronger? But as the figure stepped closer, Tom saw that it was just a young boy from the village, his eyes wide with fear. Tom, the boy said, his voice shaking. Something is moving in the jungle. Tom's blood ran cold. He grabbed the amulet from the table, its cool surface pressing into his palm. He had hoped, prayed even, that the battle was truly over. But deep down, he had always known that the darkness wasn't finished with him yet. Without a word, Tom pushed past the boy and moved toward the jungle's edge. The night air was thick with tension, the trees swaying as if they, too, knew something was coming. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the dense foliage, his breath shallow, his hand gripping the amulet so tightly his knuckles turned white. The boy followed at a distance, his small figure trembling with fear. Tom stopped at the edge of the trees, his eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the jungle, the distant chirping of insects. But then a rustling sound, a low, ominous murmur, rose from deep within the trees. Tom's muscles tensed. The spirits were still out there, watching, waiting. "I need you to go back to the village," Tom said to the boy, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "Tell the others to stay inside." The boy hesitated, his wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "Go," Tom snapped, more harshly than he intended. The boy nodded and ran back toward the village, leaving Tom alone at the jungle's edge. Tom took a deep breath, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't know what awaited him in the jungle, but he knew one thing for certain: his life, the village, everything had been changed forever. There was no returning to the man he had been before this. The spirits had left their mark on him. Their whispers, their presence, they would always be with him, a constant reminder of the battle he had fought and the darkness he had faced. Tom had survived, but he would carry the burden of that survival for the rest of his life. As he stepped into the shadows of the jungle, the amulet glowing faintly in his hand, Tom knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The darkness was far from over, and it would follow him wherever he went. Forever.